Picture yourself in the early 1980s. You walk into a video game store, or God forbid a Blockbuster. You pick out a game, bring it home, pop it into your Atari 2600 or Nintendo Entertainment System, and what do you see? Something that looks like this? Something that looks like this? Or like this? But now it's the present day. You go to your local GameStop or you hit up Redbox, buy it digitally, you pick out a game, wait 10 years for it to install, and then what do you see? Something like this. It could even look like that, or that. I mean, Jesus, what happened in those 20 to 30 years? What changed, and how did video game storytelling evolve to what it is now? What's up, everybody? This is the Act Man here, and today, I'd like to talk about the evolution of video game storytelling. During the early years of the video game industry, the goal was never really about crafting a deep story. It was all about making the game fun and accessible. And while that still holds true for a lot of games today, there's no question that quality narratives are always desired by the people forking out the money. When the concepts were as simple as two lines hitting a square around, there really wasn't much room to create an interesting story around that. But I'd sure as hell like to see someone in the comments try. There was never a need to justify why you were shooting ducks or jumping on turtles, for a couple reasons. One, the expectations were wildly different back then. Prior to internet access being in nearly every home, gamers were just hoping what they bought or rented didn't turn out to be complete shit. Also, the technology was extremely limited. With the exception of some text-based adventures, the story of most games was either non-existent or consisted of a brief cutscene, one in the beginning and one at the end. Context for the gameplay was often as simple as, "Hey, go save the princess," to, "Hey, you saved the princess. Congratulations. Play the game again." Developers made great use of manuals to fill in the gaps and work around the limitations of the time, and in a lot of cases the manuals actually held most of the story. But as technology improved, it became a viable and profitable option to create a more engaging narrative. This couldn't really be done before, especially not when the best graphics at the time could just barely resemble what they were supposed to. But video game developers have never lacked imagination. Well, most video game developers. So it was all a matter of time before someone started pushing the boundaries and experimenting. Berserk was one of the first games to ever include actual voice acting. Intruder alert, intruder alert. The ability to record voice lines and put them in a video game, otherwise known as computer voice compression, was so expensive at the time that would you even think for 1 second that it would cost $3,000 to put a single line of dialogue into the game? So voice acting at the time just wasn't an option, at least not a viable one, especially not when the industry was still in its infancy. I mean, who even knew back then if video games would continue to grow in popularity, or if it would just be another fad that came and went? And that sounds pretty silly now, but it was a brand new market at the time. People weren't willing to take the risks, and the video game crash of 1983 had many thinking the gaming industry would die out for good. That was until a glorious day. October 18th, 1985. The Nintendo Entertainment System was released in North America, and it changed the world forever.
It's the Legend of Zelda, and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad.
Suddenly, game developers started experimenting, trying new things that wouldn't have been possible before. This new console seemed light years ahead of its time, and it had a dominant monopoly across the video game market, so people knew this was the real deal, and they wanted to jump on board the Nintendo Express to make themselves some sweet, sweet coins. The technology was still very rough, but storytelling in video games had started to evolve. Developers began using these new tools to create a narrative for what was happening in the game, because publishers and developers soon learned that good stories sell no matter what medium they're told through. In turn, using that story as motivation to keep the players playing the game. Again, before the internet, the only way to see how a game ended was to beat it, or see a friend do it. So even if you didn't like the game that much, there was a chance you'd be willing to play it just to see how it ends, to see if the story was good. Now, there's no real timeline of when certain methods of video game storytelling started to become mainstream. Cutscenes, dialogue, voice acting, motion capture, all that jazz. I'm no historian that can give you concrete dates, but I think the timeline I have mapped out for the rest of this video will be pretty accurate. At this point, developers had learned one of the greatest strengths of video games, being an interactive experience.
Obey!
The more captivating and immersive something is, the more likely someone will become a fan, purchase the next game, and support the business model. It was as simple as using sound and darker shades of color to convey Metroid's mysterious and foreboding feeling. Without any sort of text or explanation, it was up to the player's imagination to figure out what was going on. And it wasn't much, but it was something. Not long after 1986, video games started putting a heavier emphasis on dialogue, text, story, music, and character development. Ninja Gaiden was groundbreaking for its characters' elaborate story and anime-like cinematics. This paved the way for cutscenes to be brought into the mainstream, proving they could work well in video games. Even portable consoles were injecting story into their framework. The idea of catching pocket monsters and pitting them against each other was brilliant on its own, but Pokemon was more than that. It was about being the master, and your journey towards that goal, towards catching them all. Pokemon was one of the first games I remember being immersed in the world around me. I spent so much time talking to NPCs, learning tips about the game, the different areas of Kanto, all the types of Pokemon, and so on. And that was because the world was designed for the players to explore. With each new generation of consoles and increasing power of computers, the leaps in quality storytelling were huge. The games were bigger, longer, and they could really flesh out the characters within them. Earthbound, Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy III, Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. Narratives became much more important on the Super Nintendo than they were on the NES, and the release of Chrono Trigger popularized the idea of multiple endings, thus creating a way for game developers to add massive replay value and a story arc that had multiple branches, not just a single trunk. A couple consoles hopped onto the scene soon after. You might have heard of them. I don't know, they were something like the PlayStation, and there was another one called the Nintendo 64. Once again, changing the world forever and ever. This is when a new craze started to take the gaming industry by storm and created the most important innovation in video game narratives ever: three-dimensional graphics. Ocarina of Time, widely considered as the greatest game of all time, pun intended, was one of the most revolutionary in terms of storytelling, due in large part to the 3D visuals, world exploration, and writing. Think about the potential you have when working in a 3D space compared to a 2D space. There's so much more you can do when you aren't restricted to a flat plane. No offense, Mr. Game & Watch, but when technology opens up new possibilities for gameplay to evolve, so too does the evolution of storytelling follow. Now, this isn't meant to discredit 2D games, but worlds and characters feel so much more alive and real with that extra dimension. This explosion of 3D graphics opened up doors for new genres and types of games to thrive. Horror and stealth games burst onto the scene with Silent Hill, Metal Gear Solid, and Splinter Cell. The first-person genre gained huge traction with the releases of Half-Life, GoldenEye, Dark Forces, Duke Nukem 3D, Quake, Halo, and so many other good-ass games. The idea of experiencing not just the gameplay, but the story through the eyes of the player character has become a staple of video game storytelling. The silent protagonist was a vessel for the player to see themselves as the hero and impart their own interpretations of that character. And not so silent protagonists were also able to immerse players in the game stronger than ever before.
Don't have time to play with myself.
And what I think is so funny is how unnecessary it was for games like Mario Tennis, Mario Party, or even Super Smash Bros. To have any sort of cutscenes or story, but because the technology allowed it, why not? The opening and ending cinematics to Super Smash Bros. Just gives you a pretty vague idea of what the context for these fights are, but they also added so much charm to the game. And this just goes to show how every type of video game, even those that previously had no story and never needed one, could be pushed to add that little bit of context for the player, to immerse them just a little bit more. Video game narratives would continue to grow and evolve with the Xbox, GameCube, and PlayStation 2 in the 21st century. And this is when a very important type of video game storytelling emerged. Similar to Chrono Trigger and Symphony of the Night, the ideas of multiple paths, choices, morality, and a branching narrative could be implemented in video games on a much larger scale, and huge open worlds became possible to build in 3D environments. Games like Fable, Knights of the Old Republic, Morrowind, Jade Empire, Tales of Symphonia, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door started to emerge and brought with them incredible stories and worlds to explore. The Thousand-Year Door is one of my favorite games of all time for many reasons, but one of the best things about it is how much optional dialogue there is to read. You can ask your partner about any location and any NPC throughout the entire game, and there are tons of them. This means you can always learn more about the settings and characters outside the main narrative if you want to. Open world games and RPGs would be forever changed, because rather than going on a linear path and experiencing the same story every time, players could go search for those side stories. Players could stray from the main path and discover something else entirely. The number of options and order you could progress through these types of games made each playthrough unique and gave developers freedom to inject some pretty awesome side stories and lore, while also giving many reasons to replay the game. In Knights of the Old Republic 2, you had at least 4 unique playthroughs based on your gender and alignment to the dark side or light side. Sound and audio quality increased tremendously. Voice acting became much more prevalent, creating authentic characters. No longer did we have to assume the tone behind the words, because we could feel it in their voice.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets! But enough talk! How about you?
Music had been vastly improved since the 8-bit era. Composing the music wasn't as simple, but with the right vision, talent, and money, entire orchestras and symphonies were used to create incredible soundtracks. Beethoven would be proud. But even without voice acting, some games are able to convey tone and emotions through their brilliant writing. The Thousand-Year Door actually used different fonts, writing styles, and unique animations to add depth to the characters. And it proves you don't need the best voice actors or cutscenes made by Blur in order to tell an awesome story, because what it all boils down to is good writing. Now, music had always played an important part in video games up to this point. Mostly it was just background noise, so that you wouldn't just hear, nothing. But music has always been important in storytelling as well, because it can help convey the theme, tone, emotion, and when combined with the world building that 3D graphics provided, the immersion factor just skyrocketed. Now, more than ever before, you really felt like you were in a lethal lava land, outer space, or an ancient temple. 2D games continued to grow and evolve as well, with releases like Phoenix Wright, Dawn of Sorrow, Metroid Fusion, and many others, proving that 2D games would always have a charm and a place in a video game industry, no matter how beautiful and immersive 3D might be. But one of the greatest improvements from the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation was the cinematic cutscenes. Games like Halo 2, Armed and Dangerous, and Metroid Prime started to become more movie-like with their vivid imagery and structure of narrative. Now, did you think I wasn't gonna bring up Blizzard, StarCraft, Warcraft, and Diablo as well? I mean, if you want a great example of video game cutscenes that look like a movie, there's no better example than Blizzard. And just when people thought the boundary couldn't be pushed any further, the next generation of consoles came out: Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and the Wii.
We would like to play.
Previous franchises looked better than ever, allowing for an even stronger level of immersion. One of the standouts was Bioshock, another game widely considered as one of the greatest, and it has such an ambitious story. But had the technology to create a realistic, immersive environment not been available, if the graphics just hadn't been believable, Bioshock would have flopped and been unable to portray the City of Rapture as it was truly meant to be seen. But not only that, similar to Halo, Half-Life, and the Zelda games, Bioshock enhances the storytelling by immersing you as the protagonist, so you're experiencing the story from the inside looking out rather than the outside looking in. Creativity never dies, but you sure as hell die a lot in Dark Souls. This game turned away from the norms as far as possible, going back to the brutally unfair difficulty of some of the 8-bit video games, and leaving the story as ambiguous as possible, opening it up to interpretations. Fan theories sprouted up, people exchanged ideas of what they thought the story was about. Entire YouTube channels with hundreds of thousands of subscribers were based around the story of Dark Souls and its lore, proving just how captivating that method of storytelling is. Dark Souls and Demon Souls are the type of games that give you as much story as you're willing to search for, but they don't give you everything. It's up to you to figure out what you believe is true, what actually happened, and the reasoning behind what you're doing. And without the technology to support it, that just wouldn't have been possible. One of the most recent evolutions in video game narratives has been the use of real actors and motion capture, bringing the professionalism from Hollywood movies to the video game market. Prior to the improvements in graphics and motion capture, oftentimes characters would rely on quality voice acting to convey their emotions properly. It speaks volumes how much character development the Star Fox team had when you realize their animations consisted of 2 separate frames.
Your father helped me like that too!
But now that we have motion capture, true realistic facial expressions can be captured. LA Noire has some of the most realistic looking humans I've ever seen in a game. And remember how I said it cost $3,000 to put 1 line of dialogue in? Well, you want to know how far we've come since then? LA Noire used 32 separate cameras for motion capture. That is quite a big leap, and it's all due to technology. And the PlayStation consoles have always been notable for creating movie-like stories, with games like Uncharted, the Final Fantasy series, The Last of Us, and the more recent Horizon Zero Dawn. There is a downside to all these innovations that I haven't mentioned yet, but if a game prioritizes its story above everything else, and it doesn't give the gameplay the necessary attention to be fun, engaging, and fair, then the game can just turn out to be not fun. As storytelling continues to grow, developers need to remember, the first priority is to make a game fun. Video games have come a long way as technology has improved, so has the ability and creativity of narratives opened up to allow for just about anything. And virtual reality seems to be a hot topic of contention nowadays. And though it has been a bit of a niche in the past that's resurfaced here and there, it feels like this is the time where it will be the next proving ground for developers to once again push the boundaries. And it looks to be the new area of innovation in video game storytelling. Since the early days of Pong, through the 8-bit, 16-bit, 64-bit, CD, Blu-ray consoles, developers have been constantly learning and adding to their games. All the different pieces that make up a video game story that we take for granted today had to start somewhere. Each console brought new innovations that were revolutionary at the time. There are a lot of specific games that brought those new innovations to the video game industry for the first time, creating a metaphorical shed full of tools and ideas that developers have at their disposal. With all the evolutions that video game stories have undergone up to this moment right now, I think it's safe to say they will continue to evolve and grow beyond our current imaginations. This video was sponsored by JP Fitness. If you're interested in practical and scientific knowledge of keeping your body healthy, working out, nutrition, JP Fitness has an incredibly underrated YouTube channel, and I highly recommend checking him out. Links will be in the description and on screen. And go down to the comments to tell me what you think the most revolutionary game was, and or what your favorite video game story is. Alright everyone, that's all I got for today. This is the Act Man, signing out. Peace!